Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Sip and Talk. I'm Joe, and as always, I've got Sunny here with me.
Hey, you know what's been driving me nuts lately? Trying to figure out what's actually going on with the economy. 1 minute it's all good, the next the price of, I don't know, everything is sky high. It's like trying to follow a recipe where they keep changing the ingredients on you.
It really can feel like a roller coaster, yeah. And those everyday price changes, they're definitely tied into some bigger, more complex stuff happening behind the scenes.
Okay, so speaking of that bigger, more complex stuff, we've been trying to make sense of all this talk about potential tariff changes. It's definitely one of those things where you hear a lot of noise, but like, what does it actually mean for us?
Exactly. The global markets are definitely paying attention. They're reacting.
Yeah.
So let's try to cut through some of the jargon to understand what's really going on and, maybe more importantly, why it matters for you.
All right, let's jump in then. What's the latest update on these Trump tariffs? We're looking at this report, the Global Markets and Economic Forecast. It's kind of our economic weather report, right? What's it say?
Right. So according to that forecast, as of, when it was put together, the overall feeling in the markets about tariffs was still a bit cautious. Like people were putting on a raincoat just in case.
Okay.
There was definitely some hedging happening. But importantly, it wasn't that full-blown panic we saw maybe a couple of weeks before when the tariff talk really heated up.
Okay, hedging. So for those of us who don't speak fluent Wall Street, what does that actually mean in plain English? Is it kind of like when you see your favorite cereal on sale and you buy an extra box because you're not sure if it'll be that cheap again? That's my kind of hedging.
That's actually a pretty spot-on way to think about it. Seriously. In the financial world, hedging is doing something similar, basically taking steps to protect yourself against potential losses when things feel uncertain.
Ah, okay.
So investors might be shifting some money around, making adjustments, sort of bracing for potential bumps in the road ahead.
Got it. Financial prepping for uncertain times. Now, this report also mentioned something about Trump's comments on the Federal Reserve causing a bit of a stir. What happened there?
Yeah, initially, when President Trump made some remarks about the Fed, the market did take a bit of a dip. It almost like stumbled for a moment.
Right.
But then his tone seemed to soften a little bit later, and that helped calm things down, led to a bit of a recovery. It was like the market took a deep breath and thought, okay, maybe it's not as bad as we first thought.
Interesting. So a little market mood swing based on, well, presidential comments. Now, something else I saw in our economic weather report was that the S&P 500 was still hanging above its 200-day simple moving average. What does that even mean for someone just trying to figure out if their 401k is generally okay?
So think of the 200-day simple moving average, the SMA, as a way to gauge the market's long-term direction, like looking at the overall trend over many months. If the S&P 500 is trading above that line, it generally suggests that the overall trend has been upwards over that longer period. It's not a crystal ball for tomorrow, mind you, but it gives you a sense of the prevailing winds.
So like the ship's generally been sailing in a positive direction, even if there are some waves right now.
Exactly. That's a good analogy. It suggests a sort of underlying strength in the longer term.
Okay, so generally a positive sign for the long haul. Now, the report also mentioned money seemed to be moving into things like gold and also stocks in Europe, mainland China, and Japan. Why those places specifically?
Well, when there's uncertainty in one major market like the U.S. market with these tariff questions hanging over it, investors often look for other places that might be less affected or maybe even could benefit.
Made sense.
Gold is, often seen as a traditional safe haven when economic waters get choppy.
Right, the safe bet.
And as for European, mainland Chinese, and Japanese stocks, well, the report pointed out that the price of European stocks, relative to their earnings, the PE ratio looked comparatively low at the time. That can make them seem attractive to investors looking for, value, a potential bargain.
Like finding a good deal at the clearance rack, but for stocks. Gotcha. And what about this VIX index? They said it hadn't dropped much, but wasn't super high either. What's the general feeling there? Are people still feeling a bit uneasy?
Yeah, the VIX, it's often called the market's fear gauge.
Right.
It basically tells us how much volatility, how much uncertainty investors are expecting.
Okay.
The fact that it hasn't gone down a lot suggests there's still some underlying concern bubbling away. People aren't totally relaxed. However, the fact that it's not at those really high, scary levels we saw before means the market isn't in a state of extreme panic either. It's more like a cautious yellow light than a flashing red one, maybe.
So if we had to sum up the U.S. stock market picture right now, based on that report, It's kind of treading water, not going down much, but not going up much either, like the report said. Wait and see mode.
That sums it up pretty well, yeah. A lot of watchful waiting. And what's interesting is that the report did note that the Dow, S&P, NASDAQ, and even the Philly Semiconductor Index were actually up a bit when they put the report together.
Oh.
Which, could be a little hint that maybe there's potential for another push upwards, a second leg up, as they sometimes say. But again, lots of uncertainty.
Interesting. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit now, we've been talking about how the markets are reacting day to day, but what about the big picture folks, like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF? Are they paying attention to all this tariff talk too?
Oh, absolutely. The IMF definitely took notice, and they actually made some pretty significant changes to their forecasts for how the global economy is expected to grow, specifically after all these tariff discussions started heating up again.
Wow, significant changes, huh? Give us the lowdown. What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, they lowered their expectations for global economic growth. For both 2025 and 2026, they cut the forecast by about 0.8 percentage points each year.
Whoa, 0.8. That sounds like a lot in GDP terms.
It is quite a bit, yeah. So to put numbers on it, they now expect the global economy to grow around 2.8% in 2025 and then pick up slightly to 3% in 2026.
Okay.
Now, here's the really crucial part. They explicitly said that this slowdown, this haircut to growth, as you called it, is largely because of the potential impact of a tariff war. Without that threat hanging over everything, the drop in their forecast would have been much, much smaller. So it's like the global economy was expected to jog along at a certain pace, but these tariff concerns have thrown a pretty big obstacle in its path.
That really puts it in perspective. So with these potential tariffs, are we looking at prices potentially going up again, inflation? I thought we were finally starting to see some relief there.
That's a very real concern, unfortunately. The report does suggest that a tariff war could very well lead to renewed expectations of inflation. Tariffs are essentially, a tax on imported goods. And businesses often end up passing those extra costs on to us, the consumers, one way or another. So yeah, your worries about prices potentially ticking up again, definitely valid if these tariffs go into effect widely.
Nobody wants round two of that. Okay, what about the impact on the U.S. economy itself? Could these retaliatory tariffs that other countries might put on our goods, could they really hurt us?
According to the analysis in the report, the potential impact of retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. economy could be quite significant, yes.
How significant?
Well, because the U.S. buys a lot more stuff from other countries than it sells to them. We have a trade deficit. Increased tariffs could end up costing U.S. manufacturers something like $550 billion in higher import costs.
$550 billion, wow.
Yeah. And the estimate was that this could potentially knock about 1.9% off of U.S. GDP. That's a substantial hit. And like we were just saying, these higher costs for businesses, they're likely to trickle down to consumers at the checkout counter, probably showing up more noticeably in the third and fourth quarters of this year if things escalate.
That doesn't sound good at all. So just for context, what were the IMF's initial expectations for global growth before all this tariff drama really flared up? What was their baseline?
Their original predictions, the pre-tariff worry ones, were for global growth of about 3.3% in 2024, then 2.8% in 2025. That number stayed the same, interestingly, and then a slight pickup to 3% in 2026.
Okay, wait, I thought you said they lowered 2025 and 2026 by 0.8.
Apologies. Let me clarify that. The baseline they were working from before the major tariff escalation fears was higher. The report indicates the downward revision attributed to the tariff war itself was about 0.8 points for both years from a potentially higher trajectory. The final numbers reported were 2.8% for 2025 and 3.0% for 2026, after accounting for various factors, including the tariff impact. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes, I think I follow. The tariff war risk specifically dragged down the potential growth by about 0.8 points for those years. Got it. What about different regions?
Right. So for the more developed advanced economies, they were expecting growth around 1.4% in 2025 and 1.5% in 2026. Emerging markets were predicted to grow much faster, around 3.7% in 2025 and 3.9% in 2026.
In the U.S. specifically?
For the U.S., forecasting a gradual slowdown, settling around 1.7% to 1.8% growth starting in 2025. Europe was looking at more modest growth, maybe 0.8% to 1.2%, and other emerging markets were expected to keep up pretty solid growth, like 4 or 5%.
Okay, so the big question I guess everyone's wondering, does all this talk, the tariffs, the potential inflation, the lower growth, does it mean we could be heading for a recession?
Well, the report suggests the likelihood of a recession really hinges on whether or not some kind of agreement on tariffs can be reached.
So it depends.
It seems to. The feeling appears to be that if a full-blown escalating tariff war is avoided, the economic situation, while maybe slower, should be manageable. It's the uncertainty and the potential for escalation that's the big unknown, the big risk factor right now.
Okay, well, let's maybe shift gears a bit now. We also came across some interesting insights into the relationship between the U.S. and India from a recent speech. Sounds like that's a pretty important connection in the midst of all this global stuff, too.
It is indeed, yeah. This comes from a summary of a speech given by J.D. Vance. It was at the Anators India-U.S. Forum over in Jaipur.
Right. So what were the main takeaways? What was Vance emphasizing in his speech about the U.S. and India?
Well, his core message was pretty powerful, actually. He basically argued that the prosperity and peace of the entire 21st century really depend on the United States and India working closely and successfully together.
Wow, that's a big statement.
Yeah, he even went as far as to say that if they don't manage to cooperate effectively, we could be looking at a pretty dark future.
Okay, so high stakes. He mentioned something about co-producing munitions, like weapons, to help prevent conflict. Can you break that down a bit? How does making weapons together keep the peace? It seems a little counterintuitive on the surface.
It does sound that way, but the thinking behind it is deterrence. The idea is that when two significant powers, like the U.S. and India, collaborate to build up their defensive capabilities, it sends a strong message.
A message to who?
To potential adversaries. By jointly producing the necessary military equipment, they aim to create a strong enough deterrent force that makes other countries think twice, maybe three times, before starting any trouble. It's not about seeking war, the argument goes, but about being prepared enough to prevent it from happening in the first place. Strength through partnership, basically.
Okay, that makes more sense. It's like having really good locks on your door, not because you want someone to try and break in, but to make sure they don't even consider it. Now, Vance also had some pretty positive things to say about India, didn't he? As he sees it in 2025.
Yes, he seemed genuinely quite impressed by what he observed there. He talked about this strong sense of energy and vitality he felt, a real feeling that anything is possible.
Yeah.
And a deep pride among Indians in being Indian, and a very strong focus on building for the future. He even contrasted this, interestingly, with what he perceives as a bit of self-doubt or pessimism in some parts of the West. He mentioned the tangible signs of progress, too, like new homes, new buildings going up, changing city skylines. Real construction.
And he sort of touched on how some leaders in the West seem maybe a bit fearful about the future, worried about resources or something.
Exactly. He criticized what he sees as a sort of lack of confidence, maybe even fear, among some Western leaders, pointing to concerns about, say, resource consumption, or a tendency to maybe retreat from the future by, for example, restricting energy production. He argued that could actually make countries more dependent on potential adversaries.
But he made it clear that President Trump doesn't share that view, right? That he wants both America and India to grow and build together.
That's right. Vance really emphasized President Trump's belief in the importance of growth, innovation, and building things, and his desire to form strong partnerships with countries like India to create a brighter future for both nations. He stressed this responsibility we have to the next generation.
What does that mean in practice?
Things like focusing on innovation, encouraging strong families, and crucially making it easier to trade and invest between the two countries.
And it sounds like Vance was also trying to set a different tone for how the U.S. engages with India, moving away from being maybe too critical or condescending.
Absolutely. He made a point of saying that the U.S. comes to India as a partner, not to preach, not to look down on them. He even acknowledged that perhaps in the past, the U.S. might have viewed India primarily as just a source of low-cost labor. And maybe even been overly critical of their popular government. He specifically noted Prime Minister Modi's consistently high approval ratings. Vance was basically signaling that this older, maybe slightly patronizing approach, that's not the way forward.
And he connected that kind of past attitude to some of the broader economic problems the U.S. has faced itself, right? Like jobs moving overseas and manufacturing declining.
Yes, he drew that connection. Vance argued that this sort of thinking wasn't just limited to India. It affected many U.S. economic relationships. It contributed, in his view, to the loss of manufacturing jobs, even in critical sectors like defense. He also mentioned the failed theory, as he put it, that just integrating economies would automatically lead to peace and shared values. He said that hasn't really panned out as expected.
He even brought in his own personal story, didn't he, about growing up in Middletown, Ohio?
He did. It was quite personal. He talked about Middletown as a town that used to be this thriving hub of manufacturing, steel mills specifically. He described his own family's pursuit of the American dream there, his grandfather having a good, stable job, decent wages, a pension, something that supported the whole family.
And then he described the decline, right, as those jobs disappeared.
Exactly. He framed the decline of manufacturing in places like Middletown as a direct consequence of, perhaps, taking American prosperity for granted, neglecting the industrial base, leading to job losses and a feeling among the working class of being dismissed or forgotten. He clearly positioned President Trump's agenda as a response to that, an attempt to understand and address those issues.
So the bottom line message was that the Trump administration is looking for trade partners based on
fairness, shared interests.
Precisely. Vance emphasized seeking partners based on fairness, shared national interests, countries that respect their own workers, and critically, countries that are committed to actually building things together, not just, transshipping goods made somewhere else. And it sounds like there's been some concrete progress on the trade front between the U.S. and India recently.
Yes, he actually announced during the speech that they've finalized the terms of reference for the trade negotiation between the U.S. and India.
Okay, what does that mean?
It's basically setting the stage, the framework for the actual negotiations. He called it a vital step towards realizing that big goal they announced back in February, trying to increase bilateral trade to $500 billion by the end of the decade.
$500 billion, that's a huge jump. He also mentioned some specific areas where the U.S. and India could or should work more closely together.
He did, yeah. He highlighted three main areas. First was protecting national interests. That includes defense cooperation, increasing U.S. military sales to India. He specifically mentioned things like the F-35 jets.
Okay, what else?
Second, building great things together. This is where he talked a lot about strengthening energy ties, things like American energy exports to India, helping India explore and develop its own energy resources. He even suggested India might want to consider dropping some non-tariff barriers to make it easier for American energy, like ethanol, to get access. He also touched on India's civil nuclear liability laws as an area for potential discussion.
Right, energy is huge. And the third area?
Innovating cutting-edge technologies. He mentioned the U.S.-India Trust Initiative, billions in planned investments in things like data centers, pharmaceuticals, undersea cables, and he strongly emphasized that realizing ambitions in things like artificial intelligence, AI, absolutely requires energy security. You can't power the future of tech without reliable energy.
It sounds like the military relationship is already pretty tight, though.
It seems so. Vance noted that the U.S. actually conducts more military exercises with India than with any other nation. And he highlighted India's designation as a major defense partner, which puts them in a special category, similar to some of America's closest allies, for defense and tech sharing. It's called the U.S.-India Compact.
And he really kept coming back to energy, didn't he? How crucial it is for both economic independence and developing things like AI.
Absolutely. He framed reliable, affordable energy as fundamental, essential for economic growth, essential for national security, and essential for powering the technological future, especially AI.
He even shared a couple of little personal stories, right, about his son meeting Prime Minister Modi.
He did. Just brief anecdotes about his son's positive reactions. He used them, I think, to illustrate what he sees as a genuine personal connection and maybe a good foundation for the future relationship between the leaders.
A bit of human touch.
Exactly. And he reiterated his belief in Prime Minister Modi as a, quote, serious leader focused on India's long-term prosperity and security. His overarching point, though, the big takeaway he wanted to leave people with, was that this U.S.-India partnership is going to be decisive. It will, in his view, determine the future of the 21st century.
Wow. Okay. Well, let's certainly hope some of this uncertainty swirling around, especially President Trump's trade policies, starts to get alleviated somehow, you know?
Agreed. Clarity would be helpful for everyone.
All right, to anyone advising President Trump who might be listening,
oh, sure,
we're watching. Don't mess up the economy. Seriously, though.
We will definitely continue to monitor all of this very closely. It's crucial.
Okay, so coming up after the break, we're going to switch gears again and do a deep dive into an analysis from the Taiwanese scholar Ming Juzheng. He talks about the Chinese Communist Party's three main strategies towards the U.S. and also their plans regarding Taiwan. So definitely stick around for that. You won't want to miss it.
I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.
Hope you've got your thinking caps on, because we are switching gears in a pretty major way.
Yeah.
We just came out of a pretty intense discussion about all those new tariffs, right?
Definitely intense.
And now we're diving into something absolutely foundational, the relationship between the United States and China. And to help us make sense of it all, we're looking at the insights of Professor Ming Juzheng.
Exactly. After getting into the nitty-gritty of tariffs, it's really vital to zoom out, take that bigger picture look.
Right.
And Professor Ming, he offers some really sharp perspectives that I think should give folks a much clearer understanding of what's happening.
Yeah.
And crucially, how Taiwan fits into this whole global puzzle. The material you send over is packed with info, and Ming Juzheng's analysis is, well, particularly eye-opening.
Okay, so maybe for some listeners who aren't familiar, who exactly is this Ming Juzheng guy?
Yeah.
And, why should we care what he thinks? Let's break that down a bit.
Good question.
He's a Taiwanese political scientist, right? A professor emeritus at National Taiwan University.
That's right, emeritus.
And he spent decades, really digging into Chinese politics, foreign policy, what's going on between China and Taiwan, cross-strait relations, and international politics.
For a long time. Decades.
He even used to advise the Taiwanese government on these exact issues.
Yeah, he did. So, this isn't just some random pundit.
No, definitely not. This is a serious scholar, someone with a long history, deep knowledge.
Absolutely. And his take on the U.S.-China relationship and Taiwan's place in it, it's really well-respected. People in the know definitely listen when he speaks.
And what's really fascinating, apparently, is his knack for, predicting things, seeing things coming.
Oh, yeah, that's part of his reputation. He supposedly called Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign way back, seeing it as more of a power grab.
Okay.
Warned about the potential for political crises in Hong Kong.
Right, which definitely happened.
And even kind of eerily mentions something about a human plague before the COVID pandemic hit.
Whoa, okay, yeah.
Plus, his team is said to have predicted the U.S.-China trade war.
Really?
And even the makeup of the top leadership changes in China. So, yeah. His insights, they definitely carry some weight, especially when he's talking about where the U.S. and China stand right now.
Okay, right. So let's get into it then. What are some of Ming's key insights into this super complex relationship?
Well, a big one is Taiwan.
Taiwan, yeah.
From what I gathered, he sees Taiwan as absolutely critical. He uses this term, mustring.
Mustring ZD. What does that translate to, roughly?
It basically means a crucial battleground, a piece of territory that you must fight for.
Okay, a must-win spot.
Exactly. His point is that whoever controls Taiwan gets a massive strategic advantage in the whole region.
Right. And he pushes back hard against the idea that Taiwan isn't important.
Oh, yeah. He calls that idea suru giche.
Giche.
Which politely translates to nonsense, or maybe less politely.
Gotcha. Nonsense. So he thinks it's vital.
Absolutely vital. And as he sees it, the real issue isn't about, Taiwan choosing Team U.S. or Team China.
Yeah.
It's more about figuring out who's trying to dominate whom in the bigger picture, and also who might be trying to stir up trouble internally within Taiwan.
Okay, that's an interesting distinction. It's not just external pressure.
Right. And he also raises a really important point for Taiwan itself. He says they can't just look at things from their own sort of island perspective.
They need the wider view.
Exactly. They need to understand the bigger international chessboard,
right.
See why the major players, the U.S., China, are making the moves they are.
Makes sense.
Only then can Taiwan figure out its best strategy, how to position itself. He's realistic, acknowledges Taiwan isn't a superpower.
Right. It's more influenced by global events than influencing them.
Precisely. So understanding that larger context is absolutely key for their survival and strategy.
Okay, that sets the stage well. Now let's pivot to that second big piece, U.S. policy towards China. Specifically around these concerns about technology theft and China's growing global influence.
Yeah, that's a huge part of the current dynamic.
There's this thought, right, that the U.S., maybe through things like export controls, tariffs, limiting investments, they might be trying to, cut off China's access to the really sensitive technologies.
Restricting access.
And the idea behind that could be maybe indirectly to push China to focus more on stuff at home. Like poverty reduction, building infrastructure.
Domestic issues, yeah.
Rather than pouring resources into say, global expansion or military modernization. What's the thinking there, based on Ming's analysis and the other info?
The evidence, it definitely screams that the U.S. is seriously worried about the tech theft aspect. I mean, really worried.
How so?
The FBI director himself said they open a new China-related counterintelligence case roughly every 10 hours.
Every 10 hours, wow.
Yeah. And almost half of their active counterintelligence cases are tied to China. We're talking over 1,000 investigations just into stolen tech.
That's staggering.
It is. And think about those huge hacks we saw. Equifax, Anthem, the U.S. Office of Personnel Management.
Right, massive data breaches.
Huge amounts of data compromised. And the allegation is that this was done to benefit China's military and its economic competitiveness. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the U.S. concern. It's not just theoretical.
No, clearly not. And those trade deficit numbers you mentioned earlier, they're also kind of jaw-dropping, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. For 2023, the U.S.-China trade deficit was what, over $252 billion?
Yeah, something like that. Huge.
That number alone just highlights the massive economic tensions. It makes it pretty clear why the U.S. might want to shake things up, maybe try to rebalance things, bring some manufacturing back home.
Especially in those key tech sectors, right?
Exactly. It feels like they're trying to, rebalance the scales, reduce that dependency.
Does Ming talk about this aspect too, the economic angle?
He does. He touches on it, mentioning how the U.S. manufacturing base has shrunk considerably since its peak after World War II.
Yeah, that's a common point.
And he suggests that the tariffs Trump put in place, even if maybe the rollout was a bit hasty or messy, part of the goal was to try and force manufacturing to come back to the U.S. simply by making imports less attractive financially.
Make it cheaper to build here again.
Right. The underlying idea is to strengthen the U.S. economy and national security by not relying so much on foreign production, particularly from China.
Okay, but let's flip that coin. Does this strategy actually work in pushing China inward, making them focus domestically?
Yeah, well, that's $1 million question, isn't it?
Seems like it.
Because the sources we looked at, they definitely show China's perspective is very different. They see these U.S. moves primarily as containment, as an attempt to hold them back.
Okay, containment, not encouragement to focus inward.
Not really, no. And they push back by emphasizing their own contributions to global growth, pointing to figures like, they claim over 30% of global growth comes from China.
They highlight their global role.
Exactly. They point to big initiatives like the Belt and Road.
Right, BRI.
Which involves, nearly 150 countries now, and things like the Global Development Initiative, backed by over 100 nations. They frame these as signs they're committed to global stability and development, not just expansion for its own sake. So it's a completely different narrative.
A competing narrative, definitely.
Yeah, right. And analysts in China, they argue the U.S. strategy is actually self-defeating, hurting the U.S. itself.
Oh, so?
They cite figures suggesting U.S. companies have lost market value, that American families face increased costs because of the trade war.
The blowback argument.
Kind of, yeah. And there's this feeling, or maybe a belief, that this external pressure might actually backfire, make the Chinese population more united, more determined to pursue their global ambitions, not less.
Huh. So it could strengthen their resolve instead.
That's the argument. Plus, there's research, like from the Wilson Center, suggesting China is already finding ways around U.S. tech restrictions.
Oh, really?
By aggressively developing their own domestic AI technologies, for example, and leveraging open source platforms. So it seems like they're adapting, not just, standing still and taking it.
Okay, so it really sounds like a real tug of war then.
Definitely. A push and pull.
The U.S. is clearly trying to limit China's tech advancement, limit their global reach, maybe hoping it'll turn inward.
Right. That seems to be a major goal.
But China sees it as hostile, as an attempt to stifle their legitimate growth, and they're pushing back hard, economically, diplomatically, technologically.
On multiple fronts, yeah. Which brings us back to Ming's analysis, specifically his Okay,
what's that? The 3 strategies?
Yeah, his 3 potential strategies or scenarios for how China might respond to all this pressure. It really lays out the different paths they could take.
Interesting. What are they?
So the IA, the lower or lesser strategy, is basically about negotiating, delaying, playing for time, trying to manage the pressure without escalating things too much.
Okay, the diplomatic, cautious route.
Kind of. Then there's the middle strategy.
Nice.
This one focuses more on inflicting economic pain on the U.S.
How?
Trying to hurt U.S. businesses or consumers enough to maybe sway American domestic opinion, put pressure on the U.S. government to back off.
Hitting them where it hurts economically.
Exactly. And then there's the upper or highest strategy. And this one is, well, it's pretty alarming.
What does that involve?
It involves potentially seizing Taiwan, specifically if the U.S. is perceived to be facing significant internal turmoil or weakness.
Wow, okay. Seizing Taiwan is the upper strategy. That's stark.
It really is. It's a stark reminder of just how incredibly high the stakes are in this whole dynamic and how Taiwan is positioned right smack in the middle of it all.
Yeah, no kidding.
And that other point Ming made about the U.S. perhaps unintentionally triggering internal divisions or problems within China.
Which could then counterintuitively lead Beijing to feel more emboldened to take action on Taiwan. That's a really chilling thought, too.
Yeah, the law of unintended consequences. It highlights just how delicate this balance is.
Extremely delicate.
Okay, let's pause there for a sec. Time for a quick break. And speaking of diving deep into interesting stuff, our good friend Micky has this fantastic YouTube channel, Mickytolife.
Oh, yeah.
And what I love about his channel, it's so real.
Yeah, relatable.
No fancy jargon, no pretending he's some kind of superhero who has it all figured out. He's just a regular guy sharing his experiences, the successes, the failures, the hilariously confusing moments.
Not all polished and perfect influencer stuff. It's just
like
life with all its little wins and sometimes epic fails.
Totally. And that's honestly why I think you folks listening will really dig his channel, whether you're trying to learn something new or just need a good laugh or maybe just want to feel a little less alone in the daily grind.
Good company. Micky's got you covered. So seriously, do yourselves a favor, pop over to YouTube, search for Mickytolife, M-I-C-K-Y to life.
Check it out.
Yeah, tell him. You won't regret it. It's good stuff.
Definitely worth a look. All right, should we get back to our slightly less hilarious but equally complex topic?
Yeah, I probably should. Okay, so wrapping things up a bit here. We've taken this deep dive into Professor Ming Juzheng's perspective on the U.S.-China relationship and the potential impact of U.S. policies. And it's really clear, isn't it? This is just deeply complex, multi-layered. There are no easy answers here.
Not at all. You've got the U.S. understandably concerned about tech theft, about China's growing global influence, and they're trying to push back, set some boundaries.
Trying to manage the situation.
But then you have China seeing all that as containment, as an unfair attempt to hold back their rise, and they're determined to keep going, to assert their place.
It's a real clash of ambitions, strategies, and, frankly, worldviews.
Absolutely. And for you, the listener, hopefully this discussion highlights just how interconnected everything really is.
Yeah, nothing happens in a vacuum.
Exactly. From those trade tariffs we talked about way back at the start, to this intense technological competition, to the overarching geopolitical strategy. These actions have tangible real-world consequences that ripple outwards.
For sure.
And understanding these underlying dynamics, like Professor Ming helps us to do, it's just crucial for making sense of the news, for understanding the forces shaping the global landscape. It helps you see the bigger picture behind the daily headlines.
Definitely. Okay, so maybe one final thought to leave folks chewing on.
Yeah.
Something that kind of builds on Ming's analysis, but maybe wasn't explicitly laid out there.
Okay.
If part of the U.S. strategy is indeed to encourage or maybe nudge China towards a greater internal focus, what specific kinds of internal reforms or developments might we actually anticipate seeing or, maybe even hope to see?
That's interesting. Like, what would that internal focus look like in practice?
Yeah. And then how might those changes, if they happen, then ripple outwards onto the international stage? Would it lead to a less assertive China globally or something else entirely?
That's a really good question. What are the downstream effects of that potential internal shift?
Yeah.
Definitely something worth pondering, keeping an eye on.
For sure.
Because absolutely, this is just one chapter, maybe even just one paragraph in what's going to be a very long, very intricate global story.
No doubt about it.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us for this particular deep dive. We really hope it's given you maybe a valuable new lens, a different way to think about the huge forces shaping our world right now.
Yeah, hope it was useful. Until our next exploration, keep those questions coming, keep thinking critically, and stay curious.